Valerie Marvin. I serve as the Director of Education and History about the Michigan State Capitol. I have a bachelor's degree in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Michigan and a graduate degree in Historic Preservation from Eastern Michigan University. I live in downtown Lansing in a 1906 home with my husband, David, and I have worked at the Capitol for almost 20 years. And one of my greatest delights is being able to research the women who have been a part of the history of this building. So today I will be presenting on Eva McCall Hamilton, Michigan's Lady Senator, as she was often called. Now, when we think about Eva McCall Hamilton, and when we think about the fact that she was and continues to be known for her significant role as the first woman to serve in Michigan's legislature, we have to remember that, like every other person, she is a product of her time, of her culture, and of history. And it is so easy to look at her, to see this beautiful portrait that hangs in the Senate chamber, and see her simply as a woman who came into the Capitol in 1921 and who left the Capitol in 1922 and made history every day she was there as the first female legislator in our state. But she had a life before that. She had a life after that. There's so much more to her story. And so my goal with this presentation today is to remove her from that 1 or 2 sentence story that we so often tell about her and try to paint a broader picture of who she was, how she rose to power, and some of the challenges that came about as a result. So hopefully by the time you leave today, you will have a much greater appreciation for the world in which she worked and lived, and a better context for her achievement. Now, the first and most important thing we have to remember is that while Senator Hamilton was the first woman to serve in the Michigan legislature, she was not the first woman in the Capitol building. When I talk about our Capitol today, I'm going to be talking about our current building, the state's third Capitol, constructed in the 1870s, opened in 1879. Thanks to some excellent record keeping by the State Auditor General's office, we know the name of every single person who was on the state payroll in this period. And by going through those records, we can ascertain that roughly between 4 and 5 dozen women worked in this building at the time it opened. Roughly a fifth of the state's workforce was female in 1879. This is not something we expect. We think of government as a male domain well into the 20th century and the suffrage movement. In fact, though, the first woman was appointed to a state position in 1869. Her name was Harriet Tenney, and in many ways, she is the mother of all of the women who have come into Michigan government since. She had begun working in the Capitol in 1859 when her husband, J.E. Tenney, was appointed state librarian. The Tenneys, though, were a very unconventional couple. They were middle-class co-workers. They worked together in the library. And as J.E. got involved in other things, including practicing law, speculating in real estate, selling insurance, she did more and more work. And so when he decided not to apply for reappointment in 1869, she put her name in instead. And Governor Baldwin of Detroit, I have no doubt, surprised many people by appointing her. And this woman recognized her significance in her first report, written in 1870 and issued to the legislature and governor that year. She talked about how she had been doing the job of state librarian as a woman, which she spelled in all capital letters: capital W, capital O, capital M, capital A, capital N. Ultimately, Harriet would serve in state government for 22 years. She was appointed 7 times she was appointed by 7 different governors, actually served 11 2-year terms. And soon after she becomes state librarian, women start to be hired elsewhere in state government. They start to proof House and Senate journals. They start to serve as clerks in the Secretary of State's office and the Auditor General's office. In fact, by 1900, the number of women working in the Capitol is growing consistently, and they are now working in a majority of state departments. And that's, of course, what the Capitol was most of the year. It was a departmental office building. The legislature only came into town every other year. We had elections in odd-numbered years. Excuse me. We had elections in even-numbered years. They would come to town in odd-numbered years. And as a result, most of the daily foot traffic was people who worked for the Secretary of State and the Auditor General and the Adjutant General and the Superintendent of Public Instruction and so on. Now, these women came into government, sometimes through their male relatives. Sometimes they were hired in the office where dad was the presiding officer. There were no rules against that at the time. But in many instances, this shows that women were seeking after this work in part because they had been trained for it. A growing number of women have a high school education by the turn of the 20th century, and they are funneled into office work with the idea that it is based inside. So you are out of the weather, you are in a safer condition, if you will, and it is not considered to be terribly physically taxing. So a woman can do it. As a result, many women are taking in high school classes that include things like bookkeeping and stenography, so they can prepare for what we come to think about as even stereotypical fields. Now, Eva is born into this changing world. She is born in December of 1871 in Memphis, Michigan, which if you've never heard of that, I hadn't either when I started to dig into this, located right on the edge of Macomb and St. Clair counties. It's a small rural agricultural community. She was born to John McCall, a farmer, and his wife, Anna Pierce McCall. And it was, I believe, to Eva's good fortune that her parents were not only farmers, her father was also a member of the Grange. The Grange was a combination advocacy organization and fraternal organization that was born in the 1870s to advocate for farmers and to improve farmers' lifelong learning opportunities. And from the beginning, the Grange is extremely unusual in that it is a co-ed organization. And not only do women get to attend meetings, from the beginning, there are state level offices that only women can hold. And so Grangers from early on are considered unusually egalitarian, and they come out as early supporters of women's political rights, whether that is the ability to vote or whether that is the ability to hold public office. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Eva's youth. She grew up in the Memphis community. She attended high school, and then she took normal school classes or special courses, sometimes they're termed. We don't know for sure where this was, although I have a pretty good bet in on Central Michigan, which was at the time a teacher's college. Unfortunately, their records from the very early years when she would have been there do not survive, thanks to a fire. We know, though, from later biographical statements that she would write that she studied and taught physical culture. So basically, she was a phys ed teacher, which tells us that she was also a physically active woman who was interested in health. And health will continue to be a matter that she will work on in multiple ways throughout her adulthood. While she is living in Mount Pleasant, she marries a nice young man named C.B. Hamilton, and they will marry. They will marry back in her family home, although the marriage will be registered in Isabella County. C.B. Hamilton was the nephew of a grocer. And so you can see here on the screen an advertisement for Hamilton and Company, Fancy Groceries and Provisions. Their social circle in Mount Pleasant seems to have revolved largely around their church. They were members of the Baptist Church. This is probably an American Baptist congregation, as most were in the North at this time. And they were involved in the Young People's Union, the YP Union. And from early on, we can see Mrs. C.B. Hamilton, as she is then identified in the press, taking a leadership role within the Young People's Union, which tells us that she was a go-getter from the time she was young. It tells us that she had no problem assuming a mantle of responsibility. And it also means that other people naturally looked to her for leadership. Now, in 1898, the Hamiltons pick up and they move to Grand Rapids. We don't know exactly why, although Charles will do very well for himself professionally there. He will actually become an advertising executive with a couple major companies, including the Fox Typewriter Company and also Berkey and Gay Furniture. They will buy a home in what is today Heritage Hill. Sadly, it does not survive, but I'm sure it was quite stylish. And I have no doubt that they very quickly became part of the social scene. This speaks to the fact that by the time they arrive in Grand Rapids, they are comfortably middle class. And I believe actually came to be really upper middle class within Grand Rapids society. They would spend most of the year at their Grand Rapids home. And then in the summertime, they would journey with friends, no doubt, up to Walloon Lake, where they would spend part of each summer. When they were in Grand Rapids, once again, they were very active in their church. They were members of the old Fountain Street Baptist Church. And I say the old because they were there initially in the previous building. So if this doesn't look familiar to you, you've not lost your mind. The previous Fountain Street Baptist Church burned in the 1920s and was replaced with the current structure. So this is the sanctuary that they initially would have worshiped in, which ironically, the interior decoration for the sanctuary was done by the same company that did the Capitol's interiors, but that's another story for another time. During their membership, Eva again very quickly becomes involved in the Young People's League, it's called here, which was not limited, by the way, to single youth as we might think of them today. Young people included young professionals, young adults, and she actually becomes the leader of a women's division within the league that is focused specifically on the study and self-education of music and literature. So this tells us that this organization was a lot like a woman's club through the church. These women wanted to continue to pursue education. They wanted to learn. These were the topics they decided they were passionate about, that they wanted to invest in. And so these women organized themselves so they could do this as a group. And this no doubt helped feed Eva mentally. Now, in the early 20th century, another member of the McCall family is elected to the legislature. Someday I'm going to take a deeper dive into Thomas McCall and figure out who he was and what motivated him to run for office, if I can flesh that out. He would serve 2 terms in the state house, so he was on the other side of the building in the north wing. And it is quite possible that during his time in office, perhaps even on the day he was sworn into office, his family came to watch him legislate in the Capitol. You can see, of course, in this image of the House chamber, the public galleries up above. That is where people could come and they could watch members as they were meeting, just as they can still today. Now, the Capitol, though, was not just for state government. We've talked about how it was a department building. We've talked department office building, I mean. I don't want to make it sound like a department store, something of that sort. We've talked about how it is where the legislature meets when they are in session. But the Capitol was also a place of public presentations, public talks, conferences. The Grangers would hold several conferences over the years in the Capitol. You know, when you think about it, there's some logistical reasons this makes sense. One, Lansing is connected to rail lines to most of the major cities in the state by this point. 2, Lansing, as as the capital, is going to be situated about halfway between Grand Rapids and Detroit, our population center. So it's a good kind of halfway point for a lot of people who would be attending such things. And frankly, you also have a publicly owned building with really big rooms that can accommodate lots of people. So it's natural. Now, this tradition does go back to our previous 2 capitals as well. In fact, when the Michigan State Women's Suffrage Association, that's MSWSA, formed in about 1870, 1871, they received permission early on to have one of their annual conferences in the 2nd Capitol building. And they will come back in 1874. And not only will they have these conferences there, they will also bring in some of the nation's most prominent suffrage advocates to speak there, to conference attendees and other interested members of the public. In fact, both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked with this group and spoke in the 2nd Capitol building. Anthony would come back later at the invitation of the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, that's MESA, in the 1870s. 1874 is seen as the cutoff for the first push for women's suffrage in Michigan. That push ended in a terrible defeat at the ballot box when voters refused to amend the state constitution to grant women suffrage. So within a few years, MESA forms and we try again. You can see here on the screen a card that survives in the rare book room of the state library. This card that unfolds was actually the program for the 1887 convention held in the Capitol. And MESA would continue to meet in the capitals to bring in prominent speakers throughout the rest of the suffrage push, which would end about 1918 in Michigan. They would also bring in a English native who actually grew up in Big Rapids, Michigan, and would later live out east, Anna Howard Shaw. That's the other woman here on the screen, who some of you may recognize. Now, when we think about the suffrage movement, so often we think about these big grand figures. We think about Susan B. Anthony, but it took a lot more than Susan B. Anthony to have a suffrage movement. And the truth is, while Anthony was often seen as the personification of that movement, in order to create real political change, you need boots on the ground. You need people who are doing very unglamorous work, who are putting together mailings and stuffing envelopes, and who are paying personal calls and arranging coffees and teas and small meetings to try to bring people over to your side. Not surprisingly, within the Michigan Equal Suffrage Association, there were clubs that were established based on city, and sometimes even multiple clubs within a city. So here we can see two images of the future Senator Hamilton right here, sitting in the center of this image, and then sitting at the desk here. She apparently liked to pose at tables with lots of papers on them. Here we can see Eva working as part of the Grand Rapids Equal Franchise Club. She would become involved with MESA about 1910, perhaps a bit earlier. That's at least when her name starts to appear in newspapers as an active member and a leader within both the Grand Rapids and eventually the state level association. And she would also participate in some of the more stereotypical suffrage events. Here we can see her, a farm girl, helping drive the horses for the suffrage float in the homecoming week parade in Grand Rapids in the 19-teens. She became, through her suffrage work, well known to many in political power. In 1912, there was an attempt, again, to amend the state constitution to bring women into the voting bloc in our state. And during this fight, you can see here, Governor Chase Osborne, Michigan's only UP governor, who had boldly proclaimed himself for suffrage. Here you can see him sending a letter to my dear Mrs. Hamilton, complimenting her on her work and saying that he believes no one has done more for the cause of suffrage in Michigan up to that point than she has. Eva would also get involved in national suffrage. She would, with the Michigan state delegation, she would attend some national conventions out in Washington, D.C. It's possible, though not confirmed, she could have been one of those women in her white dress on parade in D.C. at one point. We can see here, thanks to this newspaper clipping from December of 1915, through the courtesy of Congressman Carl Mapes, the Grand Rapids delegates to the Women's Suffrage Convention, Mrs. Fred Rowe and Mrs. C.B. Hamilton were privileged to meet President Wilson at the White House. So this woman is going all the way up the ladder of power with her suffrage work. And ultimately, in 1918, Michigan men will amend the Constitution to grant Michigan women voting rights. So we get there 2 years before the nation gets there through the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And very, very quickly, we start electing women. We had an election for some statewide offices in the spring of 1919, and Michigan voters elected Doris Stockman, who had been the state Grange lecturer, to the Board of State Agriculture. This was a statewide office, was roughly the equivalent of the MSU trustees. And I say that because the main job of the State Board of Agriculture was to administer what was then the Agricultural College in East Lansing. Now, do I know for sure that Dora and Eva knew each other? Not sure. I can say, though, they were moving in similar circles, and it seems extremely likely to me that these women bumped up against each other multiple times throughout their careers. And in 1920, Eva decides she is going to take her career up a notch. She is no longer just going to be an unpaid volunteer, pouring in countless numbers of hours to political efforts. She is going to throw her hat in the ring and actually run for office herself. Now, I do not want you to think that she only worked on suffrage. She was interested in many other issues by this point in her life, one of which was access to fresh food. I think perhaps this may have come from growing up on a farm, being involved with the Grange. She felt that it was a travesty that citizens living in cities like Grand Rapids could not buy produce directly from farmers. Per city ordinance at the time, any fresh produce coming into the city was to be sold to grocery stores, to markets, to middlemen. And she said, this doesn't make sense. People are trying to stretch their dollars as far as possible. We need to make that as easy for them as we can. We need farmers markets. And she would lobby on this with a basket of produce in her arms. In fact, she was known perhaps affectionately or perhaps a bit negatively by her opponents as the Green Onion Lady. And she helped bring about the Fulton Street Farmers Market, which of course became a Grand Rapids institution. She was also very interested in matters relating to mothers and children, specifically an issue called mothers' pensions. Mothers' pensions were a type of early state support for single mothers who were trying to keep their children housed and fed at home, instead of turning them over to the county poor farm or sending them to the state orphanage in Coldwater. And statistics showed that this actually cost taxpayers less if mothers could keep their families intact. And she said the state needs to do this. This is a good thing for families. Now, when she throws her hat in the ring in 1920, of course, instantly her name and her face are everywhere. She has become an object of curiosity now because she is one of these new women who is running for office. And of course, she will be elected. Here we see a certificate of determination of her election. By the way, all of these documents, the reason you see tape on the edges and paper behind, these are all preserved in a wonderful scrapbook in the Library of Michigan, up in the rare book room, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. Now, of course, once she is elected, she becomes part of this first nationwide crop of women coming into public office. So she is discussed in the same breath and the same newspaper articles as women from other states. And there's a big question. What are these lady legislators going to do? And one of the first discussions is how to even refer to them. Is she Mrs. Senator Hamilton? Is she Senator Mrs. Hamilton? Is she still Mrs. C.B. Hamilton? Or is she now Eva Hamilton, Eva M. Hamilton? Interesting matter. Where is she going to sit on the floor? Will we place a spittoon next to her desk? Did the gentlemen working in the room need to now worry about their language because a woman is going to be legislating right next to them? We have to think about this. You know, we often talk about how being a first is a great honor. But the truth is, there's also an immense burden to it because you are an object of curiosity. And to be frank, not everybody is naturally supportive. There are some people, frankly, who watch and wait for you to fail. And I have no doubt she felt the weight of that as she first stepped onto the Senate floor as a senator in January of 1921. She would have a seat right up in front. The members would sit according to their district number. She was from District 16, so halfway through the 32-member Senate. And we know that on the first day she came in, her desk was covered in floral tributes. Now, it might be nice to think the other legislators had given her these flowers, or the folks in the Capitol. No, in truth, they were sent from some of her fellow suffrage workers, who were also a part of the Capitol community in that they were continuing to lobby for other reforms, including those mothers' pensions. Now, Eva will experience several significant firsts as a senator. She is the first woman legislator who gets to cast a vote on behalf of others. She is the first who will get to help host the governor for the State of the State address as a combined body with the House. She will be the first to actually ascend the rostrum and preside during Committee of the Whole. It had to be very exciting and probably nerve-wracking in their many days. And she did her best to keep her cool. Now, when she did get frustrated and felt a little overwhelmed by the maleness of it all, there were places she could go to escape. In fact, by the 1920s, we know that the majority of most of the clerks in the Capitol were women. The difference now, though, was that, well, the state librarian continued to be a woman, and there would eventually be a woman who would lead what would become known as the welfare department in the 1930s. In general, women were increasingly being funneled into low-level positions that did not provide much opportunity for advancement. So they were the worker bees. They were not necessarily the leaders. And it is interesting to think about how these other women in the Capitol thought of Senator Hamilton, because they would have seen her. They would have run into her in the bathroom. They would have seen her walking through the halls. Perhaps she became friends with some of them. She probably knew some of them coming in because of the advocacy work that she had been doing for well over a decade by this point. Now, not surprisingly, she is photographed. She is written about, even in general articles where we see members take oath of office. Well, by members, we mean all of those men and Senator Hamilton, or the lady senator, as she is referred to in another title. You can see she wins approval. Now, did she feel like she needed everyone's approval? Can't say. But everyone gave her at least a gracious welcome those first couple days. I have to imagine this woman felt like she was under a constant microscope. And she did her best, not only in the Capitol, but also out and about, because of course you don't leave the office behind when you leave the office building. She was a sitting senator for 2 years. That means in some ways she is always working back home in her district in Grand Rapids. And it also means she is traveling across the state working on numerous issues. In fact, at this time in Michigan history, every single state institution, meaning each college, each public school, by that I mean colleges and universities, each state prison, the asylums, the reform schools, they all had their own legislative committee whose duty it was to go visit their institution during a break in session, learn about what their needs were, what their appropriations requests were, and then come back to Lansing and convey that need to the rest of the members so they could put together the budget. Now, she is appointed to multiple committees and will serve she will actually chair the committee for the Northern Normal School. So this is what we today know as Northern Michigan University. So she is part of a group of senators who take the train up to Marquette and not only meet to discuss the normal school, they will also go to the prison that is down the road. And while she is there, she is interviewed by a member of the UP Press. And it's very interesting to see some of the language he uses. How does it seem to be in the Senate with all those men? Asked the impertinent reporter of State Senator Eva L. Hamilton, that's a typo, of Grand Rapids at the Douglas House yesterday. Mrs. Hamilton, who was chairman of the Senate committee at the Marquette Normal School, came to Houghton with other members of her committee and the House committees to join the Senate and House committees of the College of Mines and visit this district. So this is another stop on the UP junket, if you will. She is the only woman member of the Senate. Not at all strange, said Senator Hamilton. You see, I have 5 brothers, so I have had considerable training along that line. No, I find the members of the Senate all perfectly lovely to me, and we all get along splendidly. Don't we, boys? I have to say, I love that. As many times as I am sure she was called a girl, I love that she refers to her fellow legislators as the boys. The latter remark was addressed to several members of the legislature standing nearby. Just why would you want to be a senator? Mrs. Hamilton, not Senator Hamilton, was asked. The news hound remarking that he simply had to be inquisitive and as curious as a woman is supposed to be. Well, really now, I didn't seek the office. You know how it goes in politics. Upon the solicitation of my friends, I have decided to be a candidate, etc., etc. The article goes on to also, of course, provide a physical description of her. This curious reporter describes Mrs. Hamilton as petite, gracious, friendly, and frank. She is quite independent and well able to do and act for herself. She even insists upon carrying her own grip, meaning briefcase. Parentheses. And one legislator was mean enough yesterday to slip a brick into it. Her fellow salons have a high regard for her ability and the manner in which she has taken a hold of her new duties. She doesn't presume to intrude, yet manages to carry out her own ideas of things and to accomplish results. In other words, she is considered tactful and diplomatic. She refers to her fellow legislators as the boys, and the friendly feeling naturally makes an impression. Wow, there is so much there to unpack. Now, of course, she came in with certain goals, and she would author about a dozen bills, roughly half of which passed. One of them dealt with school teachers. She wanted Michigan to establish a retirement system for public school teachers. Ultimately, that bill would not pass. She wanted to expand the relief provided through mothers' pensions. She was interested in conservation of the natural environment. And she also felt that it was very important that civics were taught in public school. Here we have, from that scrapbook, my very favorite photo of Senator Hamilton, who is standing in the governor's office behind Governor Grosbeck, surrounded by other legislators, all of whom are men, as Governor Grosbeck signs on the Mother's Pension Act bill. I love this photo because I love how proud she looks. All of the men are staring down, watching Governor Grosbeck, who's watching what he's signing. She is staring straight at the camera, smiling proudly. Look at her confidence and her joy that she has made a difference. She has helped people, and not just people back home in her Grand Rapids district. She has helped women across the state, and perhaps through a ripple effect beyond that. Now, that is not to say that everything she touched turned to gold and everything worked perfectly. She suffered plenty of losses as well. And she had to be very careful about choosing her moments. She waited almost 3 months before she gave what was called her maiden speech. By that, what we mean is she stood up during Senate session and made public remarks on a bill being discussed. And the bill that she chose to address was not one of her own. The bill had to do with public health. This bill, written by a male legislator, would have required anyone applying for a marriage license to prove that they were in good health. Stop and think about that for a minute. We all know what's being talked about, but certain words were never said during the matter of discussion and debate. But Senator Hamilton, as the only woman in the room, as the only woman legislator, stood up and she said, "I rise to speak today because I cannot stay silent." She said no young woman wants to believe anything bad about the man she loves and marries. But the truth is, too many women become sick as a result of that marriage. They acquire a communicable disease, and some of them become barren as a result, only able to have one child, if that, and many of them will die. By marrying men who are carrying diseases they know nothing of, women commit involuntary suicide. This must be stopped. Now, I paraphrase that slightly, but that gets at the heart of her argument. It is, of course, said that you could have heard a pin drop in the chamber as she was speaking. Now, there were other women in the room up in the public gallery, watching and listening. But of course, the floor was full of men. And to their credit, it is said that several of her fellow senators stood up, came over to her desk, and shook her hand and congratulated her on her courage after her speech. But she did not sway enough of them to pass the bill, which went down in defeat by 2 votes. And it really gets at an important question here. For whom did she speak? Was she there simply to represent her Grand Rapids district? Was she there as a woman to legislate on behalf of other women, of other girls, of children? We talked about a lot of complicated things in that session. Age of consent, in addition to communicable diseases and mothers' pensions. There was also legislation discussed regarding movies. Movies are growing in popularity in the 20s, and this is before there's any rating system. This is the pre-code era. And there were some who felt that Michigan should set up a board to somehow screen movies, not in terms of putting them up on a screen, but to create some sort of system that established censorship, if you will, or at least established boundaries for what children could see. And she said, you know, this worries me. She said, I am not a fan of censorship. I don't think it is my job as a member of the government to tell other people what they can consume. And that made her very unpopular with a lot of the women who had worked to get her elected. And it is a reminder that at the end of the day, every legislator has to answer to their own conscience, as well as to the voters. And frankly, she struggled with this because she knew that not only did she carry the weight of her own responsibility in her district, she also knew that if she overstepped, she could affect the future careers of other women who wanted to follow in her footsteps. Later on, she would say this, I realize that any mistake I might make will prove costly to other women. By one foolish act, I can undo all that thousands of women have accomplished by their earnest endeavor over a period of years. For that reason, I am proceeding more cautiously, perhaps than is necessary, and certainly more than any woman who will succeed me will find it wise to do. It also makes me wonder, what did she really want to accomplish? How much did she want to dive into these controversial, if important, topics? Now, ultimately, she did not satisfy her voters. She lost in the 1922 primary to a local furniture titan, if you will. And thus, after 2 years, her legislative career was ended. And because she was not the average legislator, well, her defeat, as you can see, made front page news in the biggest newspapers in Michigan. The Detroit Free Press on the front page included her photo and a title saying "Woman Senator Who Was Defeated in Kent District." How bitter that must have been. But she did not simply go home and decide to become a hermit. That was not Eva's style. She continued to be involved with the Michigan League of Women Voters, which forms after Michigan women get the right to vote in 1918. And she will, in the early 1920s, help host a Michigan League of Women Voters conference at the old Pentland Hotel in Grand Rapids, up in their beautiful ballroom. She will spend time traveling. She will eventually take a cruise to Europe, and she will attend a session of the UK Parliament as the special guest of the Speaker of the House. She is accorded this honor because she is a lady legislator, that oh so rare creature. And so certainly we must honor her and we must hold her up, particularly at a moment as British women are gaining more voting rights. Doubtlessly, I'm sure many people who met her in Parliament also had opinions about her. She would eventually join the National Order of Women Legislators once that forms in the 1930s. This tells us that being a senator is going to be a part of her identity for the rest of her life. And this is how people will see her now. In fact, in 1946, 25 years after she first swore the oath of office and stepped onto the Senate floor as a member, she was invited back by the Senate, and she spoke on the 25th anniversary of her time in office. We have a couple snippets of her response, of her remarks here. She says, "You are using me as a way of conveying to the women of Michigan your regard for them," she told the Senate. "There are many women in Michigan who have been trained to occupy positions of public trust. Yet where are they?" Her remarks seem to ask. And as she looked out across the room, she didn't see anyone. She didn't see anyone like her, because the truth is, 25 years later, there has still not been a second lady senator elected in Michigan. There were women in the House chamber now, somewhat consistently, but not yet in the Senate. In fact, when she died in 1948, she and Charles died in Grand Rapids at their home just within a few days of each other. She was still the only woman who had ever served in the Michigan Senate. And in tribute to this, a Democrat, so a woman on the other side of the aisle, Eva was a Republican, a Democratic former House member, Mrs. Elizabeth Beelan, or Representative Elizabeth Beelan of Ingham County, got together a whole bunch of women, and they decided to honor Senator Hamilton by having a picture of her enhanced, basically painted over. And this picture was unveiled in the Senate chamber and hung in the Capitol building in March of 1949. And that picture would hang there for a long time to come. Now, here we can see this image. As I said earlier, most of these images have come from this scrapbook at a rare book room at the Library of Michigan. So if you would like to see these things, if you would like to see that image of her portrait, the program from the unveiling ceremony, you can do that yourself. These are all publicly accessible. And the truth is, while this portrait would continue to hang there for a long time, it would eventually be replaced because of condition issues. Hence the portrait that you saw at the beginning of this presentation. This, though, has to be my favorite photograph of it, because it speaks to the fact that one woman after another saw herself following in Eva's shoes. Here we can see the second woman elected to the Michigan Senate, a Black woman born in the segregated South who came to Michigan with her parents, who grew up in Detroit, who went to an HBCU and got her law degree at Wayne State, Senator Cora Brown, who stands on the left, elected in 1952. Next to her, we see Representative Charlene White, the first Black woman elected to the Michigan House. And when they were asked to pose together for a photograph to go in the newspaper in 1953, they decided to stand together under that portrait of Eva McCall Hamilton. They understood that even though they were very different from Senator Hamilton, they were also her political daughters. They were following in her footsteps. And I will tell you, women today continue to feel a kinship with her, including Senator Winnie Brinks, who some of you in this room doubtlessly know quite well. Senator Brinks represents some of the same district that Eva did, and it very much feels that she is in some ways Eva's daughter. In fact, a couple years ago, as a photographic portrait of her was unveiled in a Senate meeting room, we had a ceremony to mark the event. And afterwards, I asked for a copy of her remarks because something she said just really struck a chord with me. And I want to share that with you now. She said, "I've grown to believe there's a kinship across time and place shared by those of us who achieve first. We have an intimate knowledge," and let me back up. Senator Brinks, if you are not aware, is the first woman to serve as Senate Majority Leader in Michigan. Let me start again. "I've grown to believe there's a kinship across time and place shared by those who achieve first. We have an intimate knowledge of the barriers faced, the challenges of the task before us, and the additional scrutiny under which we must perform our duties simply because who we are is unprecedented. I share that kinship with Eva McCall Hamilton, whose portrait hangs in the Senate chamber. Every day, I give her a knowing glance, and she gives me courage in return." I know exactly what Senator Brinks means, because there have been many days when things have been a bit rough in the Capitol in my world, when I have gone upstairs and sat in the Senate gallery and looked at that new portrait of Eva. This portrait came in the 1990s to replace the previous image that was in very poor shape. And as I look at Eva, as I look at Senator Hamilton, I too draw courage from her. She had a long, winding road to the Capitol. Many of her days there were extremely difficult. And her life after the Capitol, likewise, had ups and downs. But through it all, she kept putting one foot in front of the other, because she knew that she had not only the ability to legislate for 2 years, she had the ability to chart a new course forward. And there are many of us still today who are following in her footsteps. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for this opportunity to present. If you have any questions about Senator Hamilton that you would like to send me, here is my contact information. You're welcome to send me an email. If you are interested in other topics related to Capitol history, I would also encourage you to check us out on social media, spend some time on our website. The History and Education Department at the Capitol is always producing new content where we can share more stories of the men and women who have been a part of our Capitol community over the decades. Thank you so much, and have a good day.